All right, welcome to the Stranger Theology podcast. I'm Dr. Joel, and I'm with one of our resident theologians for the Stranger Theology Substack, Jeremy Jenkins. If you guys don't know Jeremy Jenkins, you should know Jeremy. Jeremy, I brag about you all the time because mostly whenever people ask me any question about world religions, and often it's about like Hinduism or Buddhism or something, I think sometimes people kind of just get this presupposition. They have this belief system that just because I earned a PhD, like I know like everything about all things.
Yeah.
And I'm like, actually, no. Sure. Part of the process of earning a PhD is you learn what you don't know, actually much more, like it's like, oh, I'm really unaware of these areas. And so I am always pointing people to you. I'm like, well, you need to go to my friend who's a world religions expert that doesn't just think theoretically and theologically about this, but has actually gone to India, went to the Ganges River, like did the whole deal. And so, man, I'm just so excited and grateful when I reach out to you and ask you to be a part of our contributor team in this kind of concept that you said yes, because we live in a world that is more in tune to the things of the spiritual than ever before. And I've always said, and I truly do believe, Jeremy, that as Christians, we actually have the most coherent response and answer to the things of the spiritual world and spiritual nature than anyone else. And yet, sadly, it feels like we are also the ones that often don't have the answers or don't have the framework or the ideology to navigate it. Yeah. And I think it's because we have post-Enlightenment, 21st century. We could probably go back to like Augustine and some other issues in like early church. But it's like we've started to demythologize the Bible. And so this has been a project. Stranger Theology has been a project where we're trying to take the mythos, and I'm using that in a technical term, but like the cosmic reality and reinsert it into the biblical text where it should and has always rightly belonged, how the ancient readers understood it. And so all of it to say, introduction, this is like our very first podcast that we're doing together. I'm sure this thing will change and go, but you're going to contribute a series of articles for us over this year. And I was so hyped, so stoked when you sent me the first draft of this article. And one of the things I realized as I was reading through it is, and this happens to me often, and I know it happens to you, is we live in this world sometimes. And so there's kind of like, we kind of already have definitions and ideas and working knowledge or context around what's happening. And yet other people are like super interested in this and they don't know what the cult of Santeria is. They don't have a framework of what paganism is or what neo-paganism is. And so your article is on the Substack right now. It's available for all paid subscribers to the Stranger Theology Substack. And this episode is really a 30,000 foot kind of entry point to talk about the bigger ideas and really hopefully an encouragement for people to dig into the actual essay and article, because we want people to read. Like we want you to be informed. We want you to look at the footnotes. We want you to be stirred in your imagination, but also stimulated intellectually, so that we can have just coherent responses to this. So Jeremy, first, like why this article? Like of all the articles, of all the topics to start with, why this one? And particularly, I loved the way you started. Like maybe he was hearing voices. Yeah. It was like so epic.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And it really, the reason for starting with this article was, it stems really from what you and like the Blurry Creatures guys have been trying to do, which to minimalize it is, really continuing on with the legacy of the late Michael Heiser. And this article is based on the time in my life when I think in the article, I used the phrase like the knowledge of the spiritual world went from my head to my heart.
Right.
It went from a theoretical, like orthodoxy, like the idea that like, hey, I'm a pastor. I'm involved in missions. My church is, somewhere between Southern Baptist and Pentecostal charismatic. So it's like, I can profess to a belief in angels and demons and spiritual warfare. But and I had seen those things before the events of this article and during a trip to Cuba. But something about this, just the logical side of it, and that's why I started with that phrase, maybe he really was hearing voices. It really attacked that Western materialist, you use the phrase that I use all the time, which is post-enlightenment, sentimentality, where when we meet somebody or we come across something that's a little bit difficult to explain, in the West, even inside the church, our default is usually a materialistic explanation. So you come across somebody who is hearing voices, they're exhibiting patterns of something that maybe could be possession, or maybe it's like a shaman type thing. And not that it's always wrong to go to a physiological answer, but in the West, we usually, our default is to investigate the physiological reasons. And then if we exhaust those, then pivot as believers to, well, then maybe it actually is spiritual warfare. In this instance that I describe in the article was really, it was like very quickly the logical stars aligned, where I quickly realized, wait, hold on. And readers can go read it if they're a paid subscriber. Like, I detail how the name of Jesus seemed to have power over these voices that this guy was hearing. And so very quickly I sort of was like, well, schizophrenia or possessed, either way, there's something spiritual happening here. And so that's why I submitted that first for you guys, because it seemed to kind of go along with the sort of the Heiser type stuff that I know you guys are passionate about putting forth, especially here in the last few years as we've kind of ventured on without his voice. Yeah. And then also too, it's just, I'm sure you're the same way as me. Like, I find myself repeating myself over and over again. You speak at conferences, I do some speaking and teaching, and I routinely tell the same stories over and over and over again. And sometimes I'll go to my friends or I'll go to the people I work with and I'll say, oh man, I've shared the Cuba story a million times. And that's one where, like, a lot of the people who sort of speak into me and are quite honest with me tell me, hey, you still need to put that one forth. It's good. It's a good one to start with, because it just kind of lets people know, like, we're going to be okay. We're going to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's just kind of where I usually like to start.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, let's get into some of the details on this, because I think that people can go to the article and read the full thing. But I think there are a couple like areas I'd love for you to just maybe talk about. And one is like the Santeria cult. What fascinated me, and again, I'm kind of coming at this from some education, but really more like armchair, like an armchair world religions guide. I'm like, how do you get Catholicism? Right. To intermingle with kind of pagan ideology. So like what is the cult of Santeria? And then how would even like people who held to kind of even Orthodox, like Catholic theology, even allow a space for them to create this syncretistic experience?
So it really is fascinating. And I'll start by saying this, because we already had somebody comment on my article this morning. And it was an encouraging comment, but she was even mentioning that she had grown up in a Cuban household. So for anybody listening or watching, I am not particularly an expert in Santeria. You called me a world religions expert. I shy away from that only because I feel like I'm quite the generalist. But so Santeria,
which is what most experts would say, is that's like the default statement. If you're actually not, you're like, yeah, I'm kind of a generalist. But
I think it's because I think inherently we're afraid of being fact checked,
100%.
But so anyway, I'll put it out there. I don't know who they are, but there are experts specifically in the field of Santeria. I am a student sitting at those people's feet. But Santeria is, you already mentioned, it's syncretistic, it's Afro-Caribbean. And so it's syncretized between a version of Spanish Catholicism. So the Spanish conquered and inhabited Cuba and much of the Caribbean and Central America. But West African immigrant slaves inhabited Cuba as well. And so West African immigrants and slaves brought over a version of what's called Yoruba, which Yoruba is a indigenous animistic faith specifically found in West Africa. You can still
What does animistic mean?
Okay. So animistic comes essentially, so for a lay listener, if you think about the word animated, so nature and its elements are animated spiritually. So if we think about and I promise I'm not trying to trivialize it, but this is the way it was taught to me in grad school. Like if you think about The Lion King, okay, once again, I apologize for trivializing it, but for Westerners, when we watch movies that take place in, more of a tribal setting, an indigenous type of setting, is what we see is that there is a great reverence for nature. It's not just that they revere nature, it's that they revere and sometimes fear even the spiritual powers that inhabit or animate nature. And it takes so many different forms, right? We see it in African religion, we see it in Native American religion, South American religion, pretty much. And then even in pre-Christian paganism in Western Europe and places like that. So Yoruba was an animistic, and still is, an animistic faith that was exported to the Caribbean, specifically Cuba. And during a period in time where these West African descendants and people who had been influenced by it were under the Catholic Spanish powers, what happened was they began to use Catholic language of the saints to designate these what became Santeria, which is just the reverence or worship of the saints. They began to overlay Catholic saints over these Yoruba animistic, what they called orishas, or just, you can think lowercase g gods or Elohim in our language. So what happened, and it's a great question, like, how could this happen? Because, in the West, specifically in Western Christianity, it's not that we don't participate in syncretism. We could have a whole different conversation about that in regards to politics and, Western culture. But we do a fairly good job of delineating religiously. There's actually missiological and anthropological scholars who even say that the idea of religion is a Western concept. And so it's hard for us to understand, but like, how could this happen? But it's a long, slow process where these Cuban, predominantly, it happened elsewhere too, but Santeria in Cuba is the most famous instance of it, is that they began to overlay these Catholic saints over top of the orishas so that they could revere the orishas openly and publicly without fear of persecution from the Catholic Church. Now, what's interesting though, is that over time, that glacial flow and movement of how faith in life works is that generation by generation, it became more syncretized, the idea. So now you go to Cuba and there is no real delineation between, this particular saint, the Holy Mother, and this Orisha. They're very much one and the same. And so you can go to Cuba today and you'll see Catholic statues of Catholic saints everywhere, but sometimes you'll see them in homes and they'll just, I don't know, it's hard to describe. They'll look a little bit different, or they'll have a little bit of a different dress to them. And you'll ask, a native Cuban, and they'll tell you, oh, that person is actually practicing Santeria. It looks like a Catholic saint, but they're really making offerings to this Orisha. And we can get into what those offerings look like, and other things. But yeah, so that's kind of a 5-second explanation, I suppose, of how that happens. And just for the listener too, who's interested in religion and things like that, syncretism is not unique to paganism. It's not unique to Santeria. It happens all over the world in every culture. And it's just the idea that two different religious philosophies or two different worldviews would be merged together to form sort of like your operating system, and a lot of times it's very unevaluated person by person that we don't realize. We might think, oh, I'm purely Christian in how I see the world. And it's just usually not true. There's aspects of other faiths and philosophies that get merged in there if you're not careful.
Do you think that's always exclusively bad, or do you think that it's possible to have a kind of syncretistic experience? And I'm thinking about it from an Indian kind of background, like you look at the Christian Indians in India, I would argue there's a lot of syncretistic kind of tendencies at times that come from embedded in their culture. At times, even I would argue some of it is Hinduistic, like Hinduism in nature. And yet there's like vestiges of it that are just good. Things that are like from the West, like we don't grasp, understand. Like I love like the talk about animism, I think is a really important one. Our family, and everybody's gonna have different opinions about it. So there's like, whatever your opinion is fine. We just watched through all the Avatar movies. We're getting ready to watch the third movie, and like this is deeply embedded in those movies. Yeah. The idea of animism, the Great Mother, and this, and what I find fascinating is I always think the very best literature is obviously the biblical literature, and every other successful story that is out there is in some way ripping off the biblical narrative. And so like here it is. And there is something to me about the Edenic experience where God creates Adam and Eve and he creates creation to be good. And there's a level of stewardship over the creation. And even in Romans 8, right? It's like the sense like, and all of creation is groaning. So there is this sense that the impact of sin even has caused suffering for the creation.
Luke, we're caught up in the crossfire between heaven and hell. We talk a lot about things that are unseen here on this podcast and deliberately buried, hidden by the Smithsonian. But today, we're talking about a practical guide to the unseen battle between heaven and hell.
A brand new book from our good friend who happens to be here, always here. Dr. Joel Muddamalle. You've got a brand new book out. You're not a stranger to the Blurry Verse. You've been a good friend for a long time, and we're really excited about this second book. Your first book, The Hidden Peace, was about humility. Phenomenal book. If you haven't picked it up, pick that up. But the new book just came out this week.
That's right.
Is The Unseen Battle, Spiritual Warfare, the Three Rebellions, and Christ's Victory over Dark Forces, things we've talked about you on the show.
Yeah.
But you've written it all down. For people that don't like seeing our faces or listen to our voices, they can read about it.
That's right.
In detail.
Yeah. Guys, I'm really excited about this book because one, I think it helps give a little bit of the background and the foundation of a lot of things that you talk about here on the podcast, like questions like Nephilim and angels and aliens and demons and what's actually happening in cosmic geopolitical realities as they're breaking into the real world today. And the other thing that I think is really special about this is it's actually advancing the theological work of Dr. Michael Heiser. He always wanted to get into New Testament studies and just that was on the forefront and just didn't get a chance to do that. So I get deep into Paul's language of household. God's got a 2-family household and he wants to have it back together.
Joe, where can they find the book?
You can find the book wherever books are sold on Amazon. You can also go to my website, muddamalle.com/books. But honestly, Amazon, can you really beat Amazon these days? I don't know.
And when you order 5 or more copies of The Unseen Battle, you get The Unseen Battle into the margins, Michael Heiser's notes, challenges, and conversations behind the book, a bonus PDF for free.
Honestly, that resource by itself is so epic. It's kind of like feeling like you're standing over Mike's shoulders as he critiqued my work, as he asked me questions, clarifying thoughts. I even got, guys, this is wild, a couple, wow, that was pretty good, Joel, which, Mike never handed those out pretty easily.
That's
so
right.
It's a really great resource and I'm excited about that.
So 5 or more copies, right? This is the idea is that you create a study around this. You get your friends, your Bible study, your small group, and you can all get the book, go through it together, and then have the late, great Dr. Michael Heiser's notes on the book to enhance the experience. And so to redeem this offer, readers must order 5 copies, go to muddamalle.com/theunseenbattle, complete the form. The 5 copies do not need to be ordered at the same time, but you got to provide receipts and order numbers. So go get that. Go get Mike's thoughts on that.
Yeah, you can order just 1 copy, but if you do 5 copies, you can
if you're going to order 1, just grab 4 more for your favorite theology nerd friends.
You get the extra PDF. And if you order 10, Joel might portal right into your living room.
Through the cosmic portal.
We'll see.
Indeed.
I guess a 2-part question, which I do this often drives people crazy, is like, one is like, hey, is it exclusively bad to have any kind of syncretism? And then number 2, is it plausible that what is happening in the Santerian kind of culture, maybe even like what we're seeing in Avatar and these other movies, is something that actually ought to be considered not through that lens, but through the lens of like the biblical framework of being like stewards of creation. So those 2 things.
Yeah. So first, the question of is syncretism always bad? So a missiologist would say, I think most Christian missiologists would say that syncretism as we define it missiologically is something that should always be avoided. But what I would say from like a more of a pragmatic answer to what you're saying is that we have to understand, and we see that the apostles understood this. If you look at the Jerusalem Council, is that the gospel as it spreads around the world is always going to be born up. It's going to bear fruit in different cultures, in different expressions of humanity. And with that is there's going to be time where the same eternal truth will look a little bit different in India as it does in, North Carolina, where you and I live. So if we strive as we should, and as we see the apostles did, right? So I referenced the Jerusalem Council. That was in regards to essentially the question of how Jewish do Gentile believers need to become?
Yes.
And they argued and argued and argued. And we even see that, even so much so that Paul and Peter at times were at odds with each other over the question of the exclusion of the Gentile and things like that. And Peter stands up and he says, hey, brothers, we should not make it more difficult for somebody to follow Christ. And so they lay out these simple rules, not quite simple, but these rules. And really what we see there is that what they understood was that as the gospel went to Rome, as the gospel went to Athens, as the gospel, right, legend tells us Thomas took the gospel to India, is that if we expect everybody's culture to look like Jerusalem, we will be expecting people to forsake following Christ because they are not willing to change the non-essential things, right? So, you referenced going to India. I've spent a considerable amount of time in India, and you're right. Like when I go to church in India with my friends, there's things, there's just, it's almost hard to explain, but there's just things that they do, and everything in India is different. Yeah. But there's just things that they do. And in the first couple times you experience it, there's a part of you that goes, that's wrong. Wait, the way you're doing the Eucharist is wrong. But then you really step back and you look at scripture and you go, no, they're doing the exact same thing we do, but there's these small cultural differences irk me because it offends my Western cultural sensibilities. And so we get into the territory that I'm sure we'll talk here in just a little bit about, a figure that I wrote about quite a bit in the article named Paul Hebert, who talks a lot about contextualization, which is a missiological concept that, kind of like what you said at the beginning of this conversation, is like in academia, we talk about contextualization all the time, but in the lay life of the church, we never talk about it. And so we sort of struggle with this idea. And actually, Joel, I think a big reason why we are experiencing some of the pains of like the deconstruction movement in the West is because for many generations, we have failed to communicate to our congregations that there are things that we do in the Western church and the conservative evangelical church, that some of what we do is a cultural expression that is not essential. And we have sort of failed to express that, hey, here are the things that are essential, right? Here's the doctrines and beliefs and the confessions that are absolutely essential. And, we dress this way because it's culture, but this is not attached to your salvation. This is not attached to your inclusion in the body of Christ. And so we right now have a generation of people who, because they've never had this explained to them, they've never been discipled in that way, they're coming to this epiphany where they listen to conversations like this and they begin to look at scripture and go, man, a lot of what I was led to believe you had to do to be a Christian, you don't actually have to do. And so we're kind of seeing how this is playing out in many different ways, not just in a missiological sense, but in a discipleship sense, even in our congregations. So the second question then is the biblical narrative speaking to the concerns of the Santerian priest or the animist or the pagan. I 100%. That's actually, I guess if you could boil down my heart in a lot of the things that I do, is it's taking what otherwise might have been academic anthropological studies and missiological studies and trying to get them in the hearts and minds of people on Instagram or Substack, which is to say that guys like Paul Hebert and Michael Heiser as well, what they were really saying was that when we look at the concerns of the animist, when we look at the concerns of the pagan and we see the questions they're asking and even the reasons that they won't follow Christianity, is that sometimes the reasons that they object to Christianity is because they didn't have a holistic gospel expression shared with them. And that's really at the heart of the academic work of Paul Hebert, who said that Western missionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries were bringing this very materialistic Christianity, this cultural Christianity to the world. And they were getting frustrated when, indigenous folk, animists, pagans, what have you, were accepting Christianity in name, but then they would turn back to the shamans or the witch doctors when they were sick or when they had fear. And Hebert was one of the first ones who really began to piece together, it's because we're leaving whole sections of Acts and whole sections of Colossians out of our pulpits and out of our discipleship. And so when people have spiritual questions, we're trying to give them physical answers. Yep. And so I think, absolutely. I think that when we see these things, like what I saw in Santeria and what you and I have both seen in India, is that we need to see these spiritual questions and concerns and even the fears and the driving motivations that would cause people to go to pagan idols. We actually need to see that as not a good thing, but as a cue that these people are asking questions that the gospel is not only is it the best answer, it's the only answer to their fears and concerns and questions. And so we need to be willing to have those conversations with folk. And largely in the 20th and early 21st century, I think many Christians, and long before that, of course, were just frankly put off by those types of questions and concerns because they were weird, they were scary, they seemed inappropriate, they seemed blasphemous. And I actually think that Christians need to get back to addressing those questions in the lives and hearts of those types of non-believers.
Yeah, I love that. That's so good. There's so many places I want to go now with that. I want to go to like different biblical passages where I think of like the Cain and Abel story, where you've got Abel crying out from the ground, the blood of Abel crying out from the ground, which makes you wonder like the ancestor cults that are out there. Like where did they get that ideology from? The Hebraic understanding of Sheol and the underworld, and even the New Testament story of Abraham's bosom, where there seems to be some level of interaction. I mean, and then I'm reading through, like, we've got this read the Bible in a year plan that we're going through with Stranger Theology, and like even just this little detail of Abram deciding to kind of pitch his tent and hang out next to the Mamre trees, and that becomes this repetitive pattern that these trees kind of matter to him. Like it's this location. And anyways, there's like so many places that I want to go, but for the sake of time, and we'll have more opportunities to do this, I do want to jump into, it's Hebert. How do you pronounce it? How do you pronounce his name?
I've always said Hebert, and it's kind of one of those classic
Augustine or Augustine.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where it's like I've been shaped so much by reading his work that I'm like, oh crap, have I actually ever heard his name said out loud? But it's Hebert. It's Hebert.
Yeah. So I've been saying Hebert, but who knows? I don't know anything. So Hebert. So one of the things I loved about your essay, so we released part one. It's going to come out in two parts. And, part one is the introduction to the Santeria cult. It's kind of your story a little bit. It's an awakening of the reality of the cosmic worldview. And then also your interaction with this missiologist who wrote, and actually, Jeremy, I actually read his Worldviews book in my PhD course, and one of my courses for his PhD, and I actually pulled it out, was like flipping through that, and I mean, brilliant. And I forgot that his context was India, like he was like a missionary in India, right?
Yeah, he was a missionary kid, and then he actually went back and served as a missionary in India as well.
Yeah,
which is a great, like, if you're gonna learn that type of anthropology and like worldview analysis, I don't know if there's a better place to learn it than in India.
Right. Why him? How has he been an influence? And I love this, that most people in this audience are going to absolutely know about Heiser.
Yeah.
Mike's kind of back, and what I'm excited about is introducing people to other kind of prolific scholars of different areas. So we almost have this like cross-functional, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, that's the word I'm looking for, an interdisciplinary approach to theology, which helps us make sense of the strange, weird things that are happening. Like, we don't want to live in echo chambers. And so, what was it about him that fascinated you? And what's the biggest thing that you could say, like, hey, you might want to think about, reading some of his stuff?
Yeah. Well, so I first encountered his work in my graduate studies, which was like anthropology or intercultural studies. And just like a lot of times when you're in school, I was reading it and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. But it was that moment in Cuba where he really got a hold of me. I'd actually finished my graduate studies, and I was teaching a class to missionaries, kind of cliff notes here, but like Cuba's finally opened up in the past few years. And there was a time in the last decade where it was really open to where the Cuban church began sending missionaries for the first time post-revolution. And I had an opportunity to go and teach some world religions course material to some of these missionaries. And so I had a textbook with me because I was just kind of not winging it, but I'm working on some of this stuff on the fly. And so when I had that experience that I detailed in the article that went live today, I remember going back and reading in that textbook, rereading some of the sections that I had read in my master's program, and them coming alive to me in a way that they hadn't previously because of the experiences I was having. And I go to meetings of like things like the Evangelical Missiological Society, which is similar to ETS, and nothing against those meetings by any means, because I've had great connections there. Is like, I sit around and every single person in that room knows who Paul Hebert is. But if I were to go to a pastor's conference, no one would know who Paul Hebert is.
Yeah. No.
And in that divide kind of bothered me, because I was like, wait, hold on. If it's important, like, so here's the people, here's the academic voices that are shaping our missions movements. There's a divide, because we are mandating that our missionaries have this understanding of contextualization and anthropology that our pastors, not only do we not expect them to have it, I'm not sure that we always want them to have it, because it kind of gets us into some weird places as far as missiologically. So I began to consume a lot of his writings. And I'll just say for the listener, like, some of his writing is fairly dense and it's fairly academic. It's not the most like leisurely reading. But I started reading more and more and more. And what I really began to see was that his legacy was his insistence that the gospel must engage the whole worldview of a person, including their understanding of the spiritual realm. And so then I was really shaped by that. And then I encountered Dr. Heiser. And what I saw in Dr. Heiser's work was sort of a continuation in a way. And I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Heiser just one time. I was doing a podcast and I interviewed him, and I brought that up to him. And I remember him being very pleased by that, like the notion that, because he was, of course, very familiar with Dr. Hebert. Right. And I think he in a sense agreed with that notion, was that Hebert's concept of the excluded middle, which I detail at length, or for a 4,000 word article at length in the article, was really in a lot of ways the petri dish that allows for the Western Christian to even give consideration to something like the divine council worldview, or a lot of the entry points that people, you and I both have joked about how often we get asked about the Nephilim. And it's like, for a lot of people, that's their entry point to the stranger theology, unseen realm, unseen battle, that kind of worldview. And what I've found is that introducing people to the work of Paul Hebert and this idea that there needs to be a holistic view. You can't just think of God high and lifted up and detached, and then the physical world. Is that middle is not only extremely important, but it actually really is the only thing that keeps us from cognitive dissonance in how we approach the world. In saying that it's really, really spiritual, but functionally we don't act that way. And so Hebert, I think, opened up the doors in some ways for Western Christians to sort of be reawakened to these things that we're seeing them be drawn to the work of Dr. Heiser and yourself and the Blurry Creatures guys. Yeah. And so that's why I continually sort of sing that song of Paul Hebert, and I'm trying to reintroduce him to a lay level, because like I said, you go to any anthropology department in any university, intercultural studies department, missiological department, they all know who Paul Hebert is. Yeah. But I would be willing to bet less than 1% of the average lay Christian in the West has ever even heard his name.
100%. Okay. So for the sake of time, I want people to go and read your article because we were talking before we even got into the episode and started recording. I kind of was sharing my heart with you, Jeremy. Is like, man, we live in a world that I love podcasts. Obviously, this is going to be a podcast, visual and audio. I love, just like different mediums, the short form content with reels. And yet I'm very concerned of our society and our culture as a whole, where we're not engaging the whole of our mind in terms of like long form, thoughtful, sit down, like read something, you know? And so that's one of the visions behind the Substack. And I know that, for some, this has been a little bit of a learning curve for our audience that came maybe primarily from a podcast, listening to the Blurry Creatures guys and myself on different places. And now they're like, wait a minute, these guys want me to read articles and, there's like a new article every week. And I'm like, yes, yes, I want you to read. Like, I want you to be exposed to this. And so this episode was really to hopefully get everybody really excited about the article, because the article gets way more in depth about Hebert. I love the connection that you make with Mike Heiser. You get into Elohim and remind me what kind of spirits we talked about. This elemental spirits. You get into Elohim.
That's your thing. What do you mean?
I know.
I don't think I referenced you in this article, but usually I remember a couple years ago, I reached out to you and you sent me maybe something to do. Maybe it was a subset of your dissertation or something like that.
Yeah, it was on Stoicheia.
So I reference that all the time.
Yeah.
So that's your thing, dude.
Yeah, well, it's all of our things at this point. That's what Mike would say, is he never had a new idea. There's nothing really novel. Just a fresh way of presenting it. I want to get to a couple of questions that we found that came up on the Substack, and I would love for you to kind of maybe respond to a couple of these. But one is, we love this question by, I think her name is Cassia. When and where did modern Christians forget the ancient worldview that the original audience of the Bible kind of understood? From your perspective, and I know that might be outside of your domain, but just curious.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying I'm not a church historian by any means. And so any statement that I make, please take with a grain of salt. It's once again, it's from the mouth of a generalist. But so from a wholesale perspective, I usually attribute it to the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment, Renaissance, so to speak. And man, it's a bad thing born out of a good thing, is that there was during that time this rise in scientific thinking, which I don't know why Christians and religious folk in general are always at odds with science. I think oftentimes science is just expressing and showing eternal truths in a laboratory or on a piece of paper. But so many people during that time really took a lot of these scientific discoveries as challenges to the authority of the church. And the church, specifically in Western Europe, the Catholic Church at this time, was very antagonistic to much of that uprising in thinking. And so coming out of that is you had a lot of philosophers who began to take Western culture in the direction of materialism. And so we sort of bear the fruit of that now. And even in our churches today, I would say that we have quite a bit of thinking that really is born out of a post-Enlightenment materialism. And when I say materialism, I'm not talking about like a desire for things. I mean, the idea that, that all there is to reality is the material or physical. And out of that, we see a lot of these conclusions that, you know, my article and your work and Dr. Heiser's work was contending against, was the idea that no, there's actually a very crowded spiritual world. Yeah. And many of the things that we see happening in the quote unquote physical world is because there isn't a physical and spiritual world. There's just the world. Mm-hmm. And there's physical and spiritual components to it. So I would attribute it in a large sense, to that Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment movement. Of course, a church historian could probably give much more of a detailed response to that.
I was advising a PhD student actually who got into dissertation writing and was trying to answer this question. Sadly, there's some things that happened kind of in his world, in his life, that he had to take a pause from his dissertation writing. But he was attempting to answer that question. Mm-hmm. You know, like when was this transition from a cosmic Deuteronomy 32 worldview mm-hmm. kind of primary understanding of the mm-hmm. text to a more demythologized human mm-hmm. reading, materialistic in kind of the phrasing that you have said. And as he was kind of working, kind of zeroing in right to where you said, you know, like yeah. Augustine, yeah. Julius Africanus, like there's something that happened in that time period, medieval and just even maybe earlier, where it's just mm-hmm. like there's a shift that was taking mm-hmm. place. And I almost wonder if that shift was the Hebraic thought started to become more and more in the rearview mirror mm-hmm. as Hellenism and kind of Greek philosophy started to overtake kind yeah. of, you know, the worldview. So yeah. I think if anybody wants to write a PhD dissertation on that, yeah. that's wide open. I know someone needs to do that. Yeah. Okay, last question for you. And I kind of love this one. And this is from Jackie. She says, thank you for this article. If I had read this 5 years ago, I would have said, yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Thanks to God that my eyes have been opened to the reality of the spiritual around us. Would you talk maybe pastorally to the person who's not 5 years from now, who is reading, listening, oh my gosh. Maybe a friend yeah. shared this with them and they're like, what the heck? This is the craziest, gosh, like, you know, like, yeah, right. What would be like mm-hmm. your pastoral encouragement to them? I was
asked to do an FCA meeting, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, recently. And, you know that, I mean, you and I were in New York a few months ago speaking together, and I speak all the time. I teach all the time, but I usually am speaking to crowds that sort of are like keen to this subject already. Yep. Yep. And I forgot what it was like to talk to a group of people, especially young people who had never sort of been like baptized into this. Yeah. And it was kind of like, oh my gosh, like where, and I'm, you know, of course you don't start with Nephilim. You don't start, I don't know. I guess, I don't know. Like if it's up to me, I don't start with Nephilim. Yeah. But anyway,
I probably would start with the Nephilim just to
I know. I guess, yeah, it gets you to get people's interests going. But yeah, I would say, and I mean, it's so reductionistic, but I would just say, I would encourage somebody, especially if they're antagonistic, like the yeah, right mentality that Jackie expressed, she likely would have, because I'm the same way, you know, is I would say one of two things. One, spend this year, this month, this week, what have you, whatever you want to do, and just read the Gospels and just read Acts. And then once you're done with that, jump to Colossians and jump to Galatians.
That's good.
And just stop every time. I'm not usually a big fan of like placing myself in the biblical narrative. That can lead you to some bad places. Sure. But give yourself permission to put yourself in Peter's shoes when his shadow healed people. Mm-hmm. Okay. Give yourself permission to put yourself in the seats of the Colossians at the church at Colossae when whoever was reading Paul's letter to them said that Christ put the elemental spirits of the world to open shame. And what conclusions would you have drawn from hearing that? You know, think about if you were standing in the position of John and Peter and Matthew as Christ put his hands on the arm of the man with the withered hand, and and it said he had skin like new skin. And ask yourself, now let's fast forward 2,000 years. Does the faith that you are a part of have room for that today? And if it doesn't, you have to ask yourself why. And is it that the world has changed, or that the faith has changed?
Yeah.
And I think that we very much still live in the same world. And so the second part of this, and this is a little bit different, is I would say get outside of the Western context. We could have a whole other conversation on why things are so different here than they are elsewhere. And you don't have to go to India. Like I said, you can go to Cuba, you can go to Guatemala, you can go to Mexico. And actually, in a big part of my ministry and work is that, hey, this is happening here. Right. It's just not, you just have to kind of get out of your comfort zones. And there's people in your city who are interacting with the spiritual world in negative ways, right? And so to the person, I would say start with just, man, don't stop listening to the podcast, even the good ones. Like, stop listening to this, stop listening to me and you, and just go to the scriptures and really allow the Holy Spirit to enlighten you and reveal to you some of the things. Actually, this is the whole point of Stranger Theology, that maybe we skip, or we only listen to the theologians who will explain those weird things away for us.
Right.
Because we are operated by fear of uncertainty and mystery. So you and I talk about this a lot, is that modern Christianity has a skewed mystery in favor of certainty. Yes. And I think that's really what's gotten us to this place that we are. Man, the more and more I come in face to face with the mysteries of God, the things that are not contradictory, but that in my finite mind, I could never, ever, ever understand, the more I realize that if God was easily explainable, he would not be worthy of worship. Yeah. And so to that person, I'll get off my soapbox now, where I would just say, just go to the texts. Yeah. Let's start with the texts. And I think beyond that, if that doesn't begin to recalibrate your worldview a little bit, man, I just don't think you're reading it. I just don't think you're reading it with an open mind.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is God in his timing and in his sovereignty. It's like, you might find yourself 5 years from now making that comment. Right. And so it's like, I love that. But like, I always think of like, man, what a tragedy. Mm-hmm. Because think of all that you could grow and learn and have in terms of spiritual maturity within that 5 years. You know, it doesn't have to be that. That doesn't have to be your story. So, Jackie, thank you for sharing from your perspective. Okay, man, thank you, Jeremy. This has been so like enlightening, so fun, so educating for me personally. I can't recommend more for everybody to go check out the article on the Santerian cult and Hebert and Heiser, and it's a 2-part deal, and it's robust, but it's accessible. And I appreciate you, man. We'll do more of these, and you've got more essays and articles that are coming out, and we are thinking up some interesting, fun things I don't think we can publicly disclose to everybody right now, but let's just say this is just the very beginning of what we're doing over here at Stranger Theology.
Yeah, glad to be a part of it.
Grateful for you, man. Cheering you on.
Thanks, brother.